Today we are looking at the rarest, the weirdest, and the best chess opening that you can possibly play with the white pieces to get your opponent out of his book, out of his preparation, and into a position that he has definitely never seen before move 2. In fact, this is pretty much the weirdest and most obscure opening that you can possibly play without getting a losing position. And it begins with the move knight to a3, the rarest of all opening moves for white, according to chess.com's opening database, but it does have a name, the sodium attack, named after the symbol for sodium in chemistry, which is Na. Now, most players you will encounter will have very little, if any, experience with this move, and for good reason. It is not a good move. It does not control the center, it puts the knight to the edge of the board, and pretty much totally gives up the advantage of moving first, giving black a superior position already. Although not winning, white does have a game here and has some opening ideas that black will almost certainly not be familiar with. So if you specialize in this opening, you just may be able to turn the tables very quickly, and I'm going to show you some potential ways to do that. Okay, so about 2/3 of all the players you're going to encounter are going to either respond with d5 or e5. So those are the moves we're going to focus on. No matter which one they play, we'll just take a look at e5. You're going to respond with the same thing, d3. And already we have a position that is so rare that it is only seen in about 1 out of every 400,000 games played on chess.com. So yeah, your opponent will not be familiar with this. Now I'm just going to show you a few sample lines, not going to try to be exhaustive with this. I'll just show you a few of the more probable lines you'll see and how you can best respond. Okay, so we should probably start with the obvious bishop takes a3. Giving up the bishop pair, but messing up the pawn structure for white. A lot of players are going to do this. And most likely will follow up with d5. You're going to immediately play bishop to b2, attacking the undefended pawn on e5. Now this pawn will be pinned, since if it moves, you're going to take on g7, win the rook. Best move for black is to play knight to c6, developing a piece, defending the pawn. This is something you're likely to see, and you're just going to increase the tension with f4. Very nice. Again, you can't capture or else bishop takes g7. So black needs to add defense, queen to e7, and you just hit it again with knight to f3. Now if your opponent knows what he's doing, he'll want to try to maintain the pawn duo on e5 and d5. He'll play f6. You're going to capture, and after f takes e5, you're going to play e4. Hitting the pawn on d5. If it's pushed or if it captures on e4, black will lose a lot of his advantage. So what's best here is knight to f6. Giving you a chance to kind of bait black into trying to win this pawn. Here you can play queen to d2. Now if he goes for this d takes e4, and knight takes e4, he's got nothing after queen to e3. This knight's attacked. Once it moves, you take on e5. The position is completely equalized. If he's a little stronger, he probably won't do that. He'll probably just castle, and then you're going to play bishop to e2, again baiting him into taking on e4, which is a fine move. D takes e4, but you can't win the pawn because if knight takes e4, then queen to d5 now is check, picking up the knight. So the better move is bishop to e6 here, just developing, stopping the queen check. So now you do need to defend the pawn. You can play bishop to d3. And black does have a bit of an advantage here, but this is very playable for white. The engine's giving queen to c5 to try to hold up castling, hitting that g1 square. And then it gives knight to g5 for white, hitting that bishop. And then we might follow up with queen to f2, challenging the queen's position depending on what black does. So those are some ideas for you in the bishop takes a3 line. Of course, that is not guaranteed. A lot of players will not want to give up their bishop pair like that, and so they'll just play d5 and get their pawn duo right away. So this is a position you're likely to see whether black starts with d5 or e5. He's probably going to set up that pawn duo, and at this point you're going to play c3. You want to open that c2 square for the knight to get back in the game. You got a little more central control. And if black continues to decline the capture on a3, let's say he plays knight to f6, just going to develop with knight to f3. And you're not going to worry about e4 here, because in this case we just take. And if the pawn takes, well, you take the queen off the board like that, and now black cannot castle anymore. You can follow it up with knight to d4. Position has equalized. What would be better here would be knight takes e4, but not much better. You can play knight to c2 here, and you can follow up with g3, looking for the fianchetto, or even knight to d2, challenging that knight on e4 right away is playable. So don't worry about e4. Now it's worth noting that if black tries to take the knight after you played c3, let's say bishop takes a3 here, well now you have queen to a4 check. A lot of players might miss this, and after the check is dealt with, you get to pick up with the queen, maintaining your healthy pawn structure. So remember that check. Let's look at knight to c6 in this position. This blocks the diagonal to the white king. There won't be any queen to a4 check, which means it's a good time to move the knight to c2, so there's no bishop takes a3 anymore. Best move for black in this position, which you are likely to see, is bishop to d6. Getting ready to castle, bishop's getting active. Now you want to play g3. You're going to fianchetto the bishop. You're going to have open diagonals for both bishops. Black does have a bit of a space advantage. Again, here, if e4, you're not worried about it. You just take, and after takes, we'll just throw the knight on d4. You got squares. Okay, but castling is probably more likely. Now you're going to play bishop to g2. Now let's look at some things black can try. If he ever plays d4, you take, and if the knight takes, you take again. E takes d4, and you don't take on d4 because you're going to lose that knight with bishop to b4 check if you do that. So in this position, you're just going to castle. And this looks kind of bad with this backward pawn here, but you are hitting the pawn here, and after it's defended, you can just go straight for e4. And you're going to trade that backward pawn after d takes e3 for an isolated pawn here on d3 after you capture with the bishop. So you got the isolated pawn here, but this position is about dead even according to Stockfish because you got two pieces hitting the square in front of that pawn. Looks like it can be pushed here. You also have a lot of pressure down this long diagonal with the light squared bishop. It's very uncomfortable for black. White is doing just fine here. So do not worry about d4 in this position. Let's look at rook to e8. If you can get it, bishop to g5 here is a good pin because if the bishop is challenged, you're just going to take the knight out, and if it's replaced with the queen, you just go straight for e4. In most of these lines, you're going to push e4 at some point. Now after d takes e4 and you recapture with the pawn, and let's say bishop to e6, this looks kind of bad for white because this pawn is blocking your light squared bishop. However, after knight to e3, you're targeting some nice squares. And here's just a sample line for you. If rook a to d8, putting the rook opposite the queen, you don't even worry about it. You just castle. Bishop to c5, okay, the queen is hit. You can just play knight d5 right here. If the knight's taken, you take with the pawn. You're hitting the knight. Of course, that's not really a threat because your pawn is pinned to your queen here. But the engine's saying that knight to e7 is a reasonable move anyway. Okay, targeting this pawn, but you have the c4 move. The engine says we should play b4 first, bishop goes to b6, then we play c4, defending the pawn. Now your light squared bishop has a little more scope. You got the e4 square anyway. Let's say black wants to harass your d5 pawn with c6. Well, you got the move c5 here, hitting the bishop. And then we got this crazy computer line where the rook takes on d5. And what do you think the move is here? There's only one good move for white. See how quick you can find it. 3, 2, 1, knight to d2. Got to play that. Now you got a double attack on the rook and the bishop on b6. The engine says move the rook, allow the bishop to drop off, but then we pile up on this knight here. White grabs another pawn. Okay, this is getting crazy. The engine says it's equal, but we're getting pretty sidetracked here. Let's get back to something that you're more likely to actually see in a game. The move the engine prefers, way back here before we looked at the rook e8 line, was h6, stopping bishop to g5. So here we just castle, and depending on what black plays, you might be able to get in the move e4 without much prep. For example, if bishop to e6, we can play e4 here because of some discovered attack after d takes e4, d takes e4, knight takes e4, we got knight takes e5. Discovered attack on the knight here, so knight takes, bishop takes. So watch out for opportunities to get in e4 early. If you don't want to get that crazy, want to play it safe, you can prepare it first. The engine's giving a5 for black, I guess just gaining some space over there. You can play rook e1 to prepare e4. You're probably going to get the move in unless your opponent is strong enough to try to prevent it. For example, with bishop to c5. Okay, you can't play e4 here because if pawn takes, queen takes, and then rook takes, this pawn no longer has protection. The rook has moved over here to capture the queen, and now knight takes e4. So what the engine says you should do here instead after bishop c5 is play a3, looking for b4. Maybe that'll get shut down with a4 if you're facing a strong opponent. But here, instead, you can go for d4. Watch out for opportunities to play d4. If pawn takes, and bishop to d6, Here you can play knight to d2, possibly looking for e4 again, depending on what black does, of course. So this is the stockfish line, and it gives black, at this point, only about a half a pawn advantage. So if you're playing against a human who has never seen this opening before, it's doubtful that they're going to play this well, and they might just get demoralized by the fact that they thought you were a weak player based on your decision to start the game with knight to a3, but are now proving this opening to be much stronger and much more playable than what they thought it would be for you. The psychological advantage is enormous, and you just might have a lot of fun, especially if your opponent gets frustrated and blunders something. So I hope you enjoyed this incredibly rare yet surprisingly playable opening. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already and if you enjoyed this content, and I will see you next time.